Okay, welcome back again, everybody. We were talking about Imperial Japan and its policy of autarky and its significance in terms of the slide towards World War II. In other words, thinking about Japanese autarky as a cause of World War II. There's an excellent quote here, again from Professor Anthony Best. You can see from this, at the core, there's a fear and a hatred of the Soviet Union. That's something that all the fascist regimes shared. And this in turn fed a belief in Japan that war and conquest, and through it, the acquisition of more resources, was essential to the survival of the nation. In other words, they knew that their role as a great power in the world would involve them in war. And in order to fight total war, they needed resources. And in order to acquire resources, they need war and conquest to get that bigger empire. That begs the question, how did those beliefs, Japan's role in the world and what it had to do to survive as a great nation, actually shape the realities of the 1930s? Well, first and foremost, if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that Japan was a country with a fast-growing population, growing by 1 million per year. Likewise, you can see that because it was not resource rich, it couldn't feed itself. It was dependent on imports. That means that Japan was likewise dependent on exporting in order to get the money to buy those imports. Hence the export or die mantra that was the core of Japanese politics. We can also see the era of economic nationalism, that era of protectionism and protectionist tariffs had been catastrophic for Japan. There had been a 40% drop in Japanese exports by 1930 and the collapse of its silk industry. So let's think about what the consequences of this were. Well, first of all, it sees war as a solution to its economic problems. You can see in 1931, it invades resource-rich Manchuria. And by colonizing Manchuria, Japan, first and foremost, gets its hand on its raw materials that it requires for its military, for its industry, and it also acquires a massive market in China for its finished goods. Now, this starts a real domino effect in world politics in the 1930s. First of all, you can see that act of invading Manchuria was the first and the greatest humiliation for the League of Nations. Japan is one of the founding members, one of the 4 permanent members of the Council of the League, which is like the Security Council of the UN. So when the League condemned the Japanese attack on Manchuria, Japan left the League. Next thing to happen really is that the invasion of Manchuria and the threat it poses to the rest of China really galvanizes Chinese politics, which had been polarized by a vicious war between the GMD, the Guanmaodong, the nationalists, and the Chinese communists. The nationalists were very much on top at this stage. Stalin began to provide the Chinese nationalists, not the communists, with military aid in order to combat fascist Japan. And that in turn really sort of deepens the conflict and kickstarts the Sino-Japanese War in 1937. The net result of this is that by 1941, the United States gets involved, not militarily, but by imposing further crippling trade embargoes on Japan, denying it rubber, oil, iron, the very things that made the military machine function, the very things that ensured the survival of the Japanese nation. So, what was the consequence of that? There you go, you can see what the consequences were. On the 7th of December 1941, that day of infamy, as FDR put it, that is the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the United States is caught by surprise in the sense that they didn't know where the Japanese were going to attack. But what they did know, that the war was coming with Japan. That was no surprise whatsoever. So in other words, our era of intensified economic nationalism had created a resolve amongst totalitarian states like Japan, driven as they were by that social Darwinist paranoia to go to war. And you could almost certainly say the same for Germany and Italy in the 1930s. Okay, to sum up, we've got another quote from Eric Hobsbawm here about what he calls the milestones in the 1930s towards World War II. And the three aggressor states he refers to as the malcontent powers. And there you go, those milestones being the invasion of Manchuria, the humiliation of the League of Nations, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, part of Mussolini's program of expansion, and another humiliation for the League of Nations, German and Italian intervention in the Spanish Civil War, and the German invasion of Austria in 1938, German crippling of Czechoslovakia in 1938, German occupation of what remained of Czechoslovakia in 1939, and then finally the demands on Poland, which would ultimately lead to the outbreak of war. Now, Hobsbawm rightly points out that we need to see the slide to war not simply as being due to the aggression of the totalitarian states, but very much as a result of the weakness of the liberal democracies, which were exposed again and again throughout the 1930s. And that's the issue that we've really now got to consider. Why were the great democratic powers so reluctant to defend that liberal world order? Now, if you imagine appeasement as a succession of acts of compliance with totalitarian regimes by Britain and France in the 1930s, you get a sense of why the appeasers, politicians such as Chamberlain in Britain or Daladier in France, have been so condemned by history. It really doesn't look good, does it? 1931 invasion of Manchuria, and yet there are no economic sanctions placed against Japan. 1935, Italy invades Abyssinia, and what's the response? Well, very, very limited sanctions, and Britain does not want to place stop coal exports to Italy from Britain because it wants to protect its miners' jobs. Oil exports was likewise still permitted, so the Italian military machine could still function perfectly well. I've jumped here to 1938 in the Munich Agreement, Britain and France being, supine in the face of German aggression and recognising its right to annex Sudeten land, which Mr. Tomlinson has spelled badly there. And then finally, Britain and France not only failing to put sanctions on Italy when it invaded Abyssinia, but ultimately saying, yep, that's fine. We recognise your sovereignty, your right to be rulers of that territory. It's little wonder, perhaps, that in Britain in 1940, a book called Guilty Men was published, which really pointed the finger at a generation of politicians, who'd failed to halt the march of tyranny. But I think we have to explore the circumstances in which the appeasers were operating in order to understand why they failed to defend the liberal order of Versailles. So firstly, let's go back to what we talked about right at the start, the legacy of World War I. And I gave you these statistics earlier. One of the primary lessons of World War I, fighting total war for Britain and France, was that it was impossible to fight it without the backing of the United States. Look at the statistics. Britain spending £3 million a day in World War I. Britain and France at the end owing the United States $9 billion and had only paid back $2 billion by 1929. Now, this refusal of Britain and France to pay back the United States would have severe consequences. First of all, if we look on the right-hand side of the screen, it feeds a belief in the United States that it should never have become involved in World War I in the first place. Basically, its involvement was an agenda pushed through by the merchants of death, the industrialists and the bankers who wanted to make money on the back of total war. And this fuels a determination in the 1930s that the United States must avoid making the same mistake in the future. So what do we see? 1934, the Johnson Act forbade any future loans by the US to any country, i.e. Britain and France, which had failed to pay back its debts in the past. Then there's more neutrality acts that are passed. 1936 Neutrality Act forbade the sale of any weapons to countries which still owed money to the US. Guess who they're talking about? Britain and France. conclusion to be drawn from this, I think, that without the backing of the world's biggest economy, the United States, Britain and France were in no position to stop the totalitarian states whose inherent desire for war had been sharpened by the economic nationalism of the 1930s. Now, outside international politics and the politics of the Neutrality Acts, etc., it's pretty clear, and you know very well, that Britain had its own economic problems. If you look, there's sort of in this era of economic nationalism in the 1930s, Britain suffers a 3-year recession from 1930 to 1932. And even though the economy picked up in 1936, economic growth dramatically fell off again in 1937 and 1938. And you know that throughout the 1930s, certainly in the middle years of the 1930s, there was 3 million unemployed in Britain, living in grinding poverty, suffering the humiliation of the means tests, etc. Britain is hardly in a position to fulfill any of its obligations as a key member of the League of Nations and a defender of the Versailles world order. Okay, what about France? Well, here again, it's worth returning to World War I and its legacies. In 1932, the year before Hitler came to power in Germany, inaugurations were taking right across, say, a 400-mile stretch of France, all those 10 devastated départements. There were inaugurations of all the rebuilt villages and towns. So it had therefore taken France 14 years to recover from the immense physical devastation of total war, a war that had been fought on its soil. There were other reasons for avoiding conflict. The interwar years in France were known as the Hollow Years. That's a period when, partly due to the demographic losses in World War I, there had been falling birth rates throughout the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, in a number of years, the death rate had been higher than the birth rate. Now, this is fueling social Darwinist fears that France is a nation in decline. In other words, just in terms of its raw population, its manpower, would it be able to sustain war against another great power? And you can see that fear in the quote from Clemenceau right back in 1919, right in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles. If France stops producing large families, you can put the grandest clauses in the Treaty of Versailles, confiscate all of Germany's cannon, do anything you please, and it will be to no purpose. France will be lost because there will be no more Frenchmen. And France was also a nation beset by deep ideological polarity between the left and right and a chronically unstable political system. Look at those figures. 34 different prime ministers in 22 interwar years. In other words, the average period of office for a prime minister of France was around 9 months. And this really sort of illustrates France's inability to provide a strong and unified response to the crisis of the 1930s. And on top of these weaknesses that Britain and France faced, it's worth remembering that there's no unified body of democratic states on the European continent to fall back on. There's no other great powers who could provide a resolute response to Hitler. Britain and France are pretty well the only major democratic powers in the continent. This is a continent, as we know, where democracy had failed. And that map rather illustrates that very point, that march of totalitarianism and the shrinking of democracy. In terms of being great democratic powers, without the United States support, Britain and France stand very much alone. Now, with this in mind, it's perhaps little wonder that ultimately what France did was to retreat physically and psychologically behind the Maginot Line. That vast, hugely expensive subterranean structure which it so wrongly believed, would save it from the catastrophe of a future war. So there you have it, everybody. I hope some of this proves to be useful, and I wish you the very, very best in your exams.